I come to a conference like this and I see so many old friends, people I want to catch up with, and a chance to make some new friends as well. So really glad to be here. So my talk is called Right to Left. Happens to be the name of my last book, but actually it describes really everything that I've been about for the last few years. And I hope you'll find some, not just some, high concept ways of thinking about things, but also some very practical ideas that you can take away that will actually change the way that things work in your organisations when you go back next week. I was just having a conversation just at the end of the last session with somebody actually who was saying she was using a couple of my exercises, and what it's helping to do is to change the way that people relate to each other, the way that people talk to each other in their organisations, and that's actually the only way that real change actually ever happens. And we'll come back to that point right at the end, but that's really what I've been about for the last few years. What I want to start, you may have seen this same introduction before, but we'll take this somewhere else. Two kinds of Agile. I don't know what you thought of 2019, but 2019 for me was the year of the Agile is Dead blog post. You seen any of those? Yeah, I mean, who here reads Hacker News? A few hands go up. About every week or two on Hacker News, there'll be some new Agile is Dead blog post goes up. It's still happening this year. And yet, here you are, on a weekend, coming to an Agile conference. Agile clearly isn't dead. Actually, it's something that you want to spend invest some of your own time in. So there's something very strange going on. There's the Agile is Dead blog post, there's the weekend conference. How can that be possible? Two kinds of Agile. And I'm going to explain that with Lego. And if you want to explain anything, explain it with Lego, right? So, let's start with Lego itself. If you had to explain Lego to a Martian, the whole thing about Lego, everything about there was to be said about Lego, where would you start? Would you start with truckloads of plastic granules arriving at the Lego factory? Or would you start with children playing with the finished product? So if you arrange that in like a process diagram, conventionally, left to right type process, do you start on the left with the inputs, the plastic granules, or do you start on the right with the children playing with the finished product? Where are we going to start, left or right? Right, of course you are. I mean, you're not going to explain Lego talking about chemistry and all the rest of it. So let's do the same thing with Agile. So if you're going to describe Agile, where would you start? Would you start with backlog items in Jira? Other tracking tools are available. Or do you start with working software that is already beginning to meet needs? So work items in Jira or working software that's already beginning to meet needs. So from the left or from the right? From the right, you would. Well, I say you would. Actually, I think a lot of descriptions of Agile are actually very much from the left. To illustrate that, let's look at how Scrum is typically explained. So if you wanted to explain Scrum in a way that was designed to foster self-organization, collaboration, innovation, leadership, all those kinds of things, would you start with 2 levels of backlog and the planning events that take you from backlog to backlog and all the rest of it? Or do you start with shared objectives pursued goal by goal? Shared objectives pursued goal by goal. And I greatly shouted that out. I think in this room you should all understand that both those descriptions are completely 100% compatible with the Scrum Guide. The most powerful description is shared objectives pursued goal by goal, if it's collaboration, self-organization, innovation, leadership that you want. And yet when we're describing Scrum, don't we normally describe it in terms of backlogs and ceremonies and process and so on? And we can scale that up. I mean, we'll have to do that with Agile. We like to scale things up. Let's do the same thing, with SAFe. So it actually looks exactly the same. Instead of 2 levels of backlog, it's now n levels of backlog because it's scalable, where n is a parameter proportional to the height of your SAFe poster. All shared objectives pursued goal by goal. Now, I chose SAFE on purpose. For the Right to Left book, I did a little survey of the major scaling frameworks. So I looked at SAFE, looked at Scrum at Scale, Nexus, and so on. And I looked for one whose official description allowed both of those interpretations and not just a backlog-driven interpretation. And in fact, the one that was most easily treated in this way was SAFE. And I thought that was actually quite encouraging. It came as something of a relief, knowing that how big SAFE is, how many people are being taught SAFE, the fact that it allows this right-to-left description, this outcome-oriented description, was actually quite reassuring. Speaking to people in the SAFE community, you can actually see this tension between right to left and left to right perspectives, even on the same project. You've got the left to right perspective represented by the program office, very often, the PMO, and you've got this right to left perspective where people coming from a product perspective or from an agile perspective will more naturally adopt this more right to left kind of perspective. So that's interesting. So I thought, how can we crystallize this into some takeaways, into a fresh perspective that's more, there's been this perspective thing of doing agile versus being agile perspective for a while, which to be honest, I never find that very helpful. And I wanted to find one that was more helpful, and I think outcome-oriented versus backlog-driven is actually a much more useful way of understanding the difference. And I've got 3 what-ifs. The first of which starts with my definition of done. I've made it, there's a little URL at the bottom. If you want to reference this, you easily can. The only definition of done you'll ever need, someone's need was met. What if this was the only definition of done we ever used? One where we understood whose needs it was that we were meeting. We had a good understanding of what those needs are. We have a good understanding of how we'd know when those needs are being met. And we take the trouble to check that they are being met. What if we put all of that first? What if we put needs and outcomes first and let all the stuff of Agile, the process, the practices, the tools, the frameworks, all the stuff, we let that line up behind meeting needs, achieving outcomes, and made sure that everything was set up so that we could prove to ourselves that we're indeed achieving those things. When you do that, it actually, and this is chapter 3 of the new book, so it's chapter 3 of Right to Left, I do a survey of all the main frameworks in the Lean Agile landscape. So looking at Scrum, looking at Kanban, looking at DevOps, XP, all the rest of it. And when you start to look at it from an outcomes-oriented perspective and from a needs-based perspective, rather than thinking that your job is to choose one framework over another, and then work out how to force that onto your organization, it becomes much more about how do we achieve what you want to achieve? How are these frameworks going to help us? How can they work together? And I've had the experience of working with teams not much bigger than a Scrum team, where we've had all of these things working, if not all the time, then certainly some of the time. And actually, and when you start to change your perspective to one of meeting needs and achieving outcomes, you stop making the framework the thing that you have to implement, and that just makes things so much, it's a more humane approach to our work. It empowers people to work out how things should work and can work for them, and make sure that it does work for them, meet the needs of our own staff, not only the needs of our customers and our organizations and so on. So really quite a game changer. So back to the premise, 2 kinds of Agile, backlog driven, and it ends up being very process centric, and I think oppressive, depressing, and so on. Or where we have the meaningfulness, the reward, the gratification of meeting needs, customer needs, organization needs, our own needs, ones where people and their needs really matter, and we're demonstrating that we're achieving outcomes. And I think the question then is, well, why is it that we end up with so much of that left-hand kind, the from the left kind, the process-driven, backlog-driven stuff? And I think we have to look quite fundamentally at how we actually introduce Agile. I've been focusing for the last few minutes on how we explain it, how we describe it. I'd encourage you to adopt habits of presenting these things in right to left rather than left to right ways, I think we're killing Agile by describing it as a process-centric thing. I think we're killing Agile by describing it as being a backlog-driven thing. And we need to move, and this is a between friends thing, we need to stop doing that. And we need to find better ways of trying to explain what it is we're doing. And we need to go away from those solution-driven change management frameworks of the 1990s. In terms of change management, Agile and many of the Agile vendors are still stuck in the 1990s, and it's very depressing, very sad that we are force-fitting things into organizations, which actually then means imposing things on people, not inviting them into the process. So what I want to do is to actually give you a very small glimpse of how it can work, for you to actually experience it for yourselves, and realize that I'm not just sort of complaining about the way things are done, but actually offering something positive. I'll just explain some of our influences. Lean and Agile, very much a huge influence on what we do, but other things as well. We want to fully acknowledge that you can't do anything good if you're not also thinking about strategy. You need to be thinking about where you're trying to go and all the places you need to visit on the way to where it is you want to go. You need to think about the commitments you're going to need, the investments that you're going to need to make, and all those things. You can't just give credit for success to process. A good process doing the wrong things isn't going to deliver a great result. The righter we do the wrong thing, the wronger we become, as Akov said. So strategy is vitally important. Another vitally important area is organization development, and I mean the modern organization development, 21st century organization development, the kind of organization development that understands it's not just for us OD specialists to understand what's wrong with your organization and tell you what's wrong and how to fix it, but to help your organization have better conversations with itself and to learn how to do that and to make those into habits and so on. And so, I've been, gathering people, inviting people to work in that space. And people who come from those different spaces and realizing that these different things have for the other things, that the intersection of them is an exciting place to work and so on. And so you get a flavor of some of that now. So this is our true north statement. This is just a little way of giving a picture of what it's like when Lean and Agile are working well. So imagine everyone able to work consistently at their best, individuals, teams, between teams, across the organization and beyond. It's got some scale in there for you if you're into scaling. Keep talking about conversations, right conversations between the right people, happening at the best possible moment, needs anticipated, met at just the right time. Okay, just give a moment to reflect on that. Now I'm going to invite you to speak to your neighbour. I know, a scary thing to do. But I want you to ask each other, just in pairs or in threes, what's that like? Very simple question. I'm going to stick a timer on my phone. I'll give you a minute to just explore that with each other. What's that like if we had all of that? Well, hands up who has all of that today, every day. Right, so what's that? Well, you could say, what would that be like? But let's climb into our time machines and just imagine what it would be like, what it's like. We're there already. So a minute now, with your neighbour, what's that like?
I have a question here. When we say right conversations, right people, what we are saying here, right people are.
Discuss that with your neighbour, yeah. We'll stop it there. Another question for you. Now, you've already acknowledged that you don't have this every day. Maybe you have it maybe you have great days and you see, some or all of that, but you don't have it every day. So the next question for you is, what stops that? What obstacles are in the way? So give you another minute or a little bit more with your neighbour. What stops that? Right, we'll stop it there. We'll stop it there. Now, I've done this in conferences around the world, and I always think it's very funny that when we ask, what stops that, what gets in the way, what are your obstacles, that the volume of noise in the room increases. We like talking about our problems, don't we? But one thing I've noticed, well, it's not just what I've noticed, you can read some very respected books that will tell you this as well, that digging into problems in organizations doesn't actually get you very far. It doesn't actually, it may be cathartic to explore our problems, to get it out there, and it's actually very important that we do talk about our problems, and I'll come to this at the end. But the most constructive thing that we can do isn't to find a solution, because in complex systems like social systems, your organization, there is no one fix that will make everything better. Much more practical, actually, is to think about where we would like to get to and how can we work towards that. So we start to have conversations about outcomes. And there's a famous coaching question that takes us out of that sort of obstacle space, the problem space, into outcome space. And I've asked you to ask this question to your neighbour. It is, what would you like to have happen? Okay, so a minute on what would you like to have happen? Starting now. Okay, we'll stop it there. And we'll stop it there. Just one more question. So we've gone from obstacle space into, and I don't know what you were talking about. Some of you have been talking outcomes. Some of you may have been talking solutions. You know, things, different ideas you have to make things better. I'm going to ask you to ask each other another question that whether you were talking solutions or outcomes will take you deeper into outcomes. Very simple question. Then what happens? So after all the things you've just been talking about, then what happens? A minute on that. Right, we'll stop it there. I hope you enjoyed having those conversations. It's very different doing it in a public space to doing it inside an organisation, got to say. But I hope you get an idea that actually these are some very practical tools here, ways of exploring, where it is we'd like to get to as an organisation, what we're trying to achieve with particular things that we're doing, and so on. We're already told, we should ask the why question, or what problem you're going to solve. It turns out that those kind of questions actually aren't that helpful. And there's a better language that we can have around the language of outcomes, and that's what I've spent the last few years teaching people, exploring with other people, finding out how other people do it, and so on. We've encapsulated some of that in our coaching game, 15-minute photo. I describe it as our clean language inspired coaching game. That clean language is where these questions come from. Rather more questions than just the few that you asked. It's amazing how much you can achieve in just 15 minutes. Starting with a list of obstacles or a list of product goals or whatever it might be, and developing a landscape, exploring and developing and capturing a landscape of outcomes just by asking these very simple questions. Then what happens? What would you like to have happen? What happens before? And so on. It's open source, so anyone can try it. I know there are people in the room that I've seen some smiles and nods. There are people in the room that have tried it. Some of you have tried it in my workshop. Some of you have just tried it by getting hold of the materials for yourselves, all completely free. So there's a link there again at the bottom of the slide. But if you go to the Agenda Shift website, the resources are pretty easy to find. The language of outcomes, inviting leadership at every level. Again, I'm going to return to that at the end. But there's this very interesting relationship between leadership, outcomes, and invitation, and all these other things that I talk about all the time: collaboration, self-organization, innovation. I've been very careful not to prescribe solutions. We're talking in the language of outcomes. That's giving space to other people to come up with ideas. And that's a crucial set of leadership lessons there. So exploring this is sort of just visualizing how all of this works. And I'm going to use some of the language of organization development. And studying organization development in recent years has been a real eye-opener. In parallel with the last 20 years of Agile, there's been a real revolution in organization development as well. And going away from those sort of linear imposed models of change management towards one that's much more around dialogue, conversation, and so on. So, and also embracing complexity as well. So we'll start with, on the right-hand side here, what is the overall challenge that we're trying to address? The adaptive challenge, the one that's going to force us to learn something about ourselves in order to achieve it. Some kind of generative image. The True North was an example of a generative image. It's not prescriptive. It allows you to you can kind of live there. You can imagine what it's like, but every single one of you will have a different picture in your mind about how that would work and what you would need in order to make that work, and it stimulates ideas. It says an organised list thereof, so things like assessment tools and things like that. So we have an assessment tool we use as pre-work to our workshops. So what's in the way of that? Well, first of all, we need to make sure we really are living there. So what's happening when this is working at its best for you? What's that like is the simple question I asked you earlier. What obstacles are in the way? We don't invest a lot of time understanding those obstacles, but just a little bit of clarification might be appropriate. What's that like? What's happening when this bad thing is happening? What would you like to have happen? Now we're into outcome space. Then what happens? We're getting deeper into outcome space. We can clarify again what's happening. So what's happening when this great thing is happening? What happens after? What kind of? It's my favourite clean language question. It's just a much nicer way of asking, can you be more specific? I've got like a 5-minute version of that, but there's a blog post you can find, my favourite clean language question. And it's a whole fractal thing. Behind every outcome, or in the way of every outcome, we can ask, well, what obstacles are in the way of that? And then with what would you like to have happen, there's a whole landscape again of outcomes hiding behind that obstacle. So that you start to get the hang, you start to practice asking these questions that help people explore that in a way that doesn't force on them your assumptions, your solutions, and so on. So it creates much more space for all those other great things to keep happening. And you can turn this picture, we get deeper and deeper, perhaps further, more abstract, more further away in time. The further we go to the right of this picture, we can tip that on its side, tidy it up a bit, and what you find is that when you drive this out far enough, you get to things like aspirations and values and long-term goals and things like that. Then you get, before that, the sort of medium-term objectives, the things that we're going to focus on for the next few months. The things that really help to crystallize, to clarify what we're about for the next period. And the key results along the way, things that we are going to have to sort out if we're going to achieve those objectives. So you could say outcomes all the way down already, but actually you can go further. So if we're doing product development, the stories, the user stories or the job stories, you think about the punchline of the user story is an outcome. The so that part, the same for a job story. So thinking about happy endings of stories and outcomes, they're kind of the same thing. Experiments again. So we believe that if we do this, we'll get that, and that here is an outcome. And signs that we're successful might include X, Y, and Z, yet more outcomes. So it really is outcomes all the way down. And we can explain that in process terms. So not a sort of forcing a backlog on people, but a just-in-time process. What is the learning that we want to capture? What do we want to learn about the world? What do we want to learn about our customers? What do we want to learn about how our customers use our products? What do we want to learn about our process? And how can we frame our next piece of work to generate the maximum amount of learning? And then, how do we frame that? How do we develop those ideas? How do we organize the ideas that we've generated and so on? This is the mapping on the left. And then we'll recognize when we need to refresh our maps, have those go back again, have those conversations and so on. So I've got just about 5 minutes left. I just want to finish with just a little bit about what motivates me, what's my mission, what's the mission of the Agenda Shift community and so on. And this is something that came out of my most recent book, Right to Left. And the inspiration is not something I wrote, it was actually something that was written 30 years ago it might even be 40 years ago, Christopher Alexander. Now he's like the father of the patterns movement. Who here is old enough to remember the Gang of Four patterns book? A few of you will own up to that. I am old enough. The pattern language conferences and all, they were all the rage in the 80s. But it's fantastic. The guy that was the inspiration for that movement wasn't in software. He was an architect in, built in terms of buildings. Christopher Alexander, wonderfully philosophical book, The Timeless Way of Building. And this paragraph just jumped out at me. A thing is whole according to how free it is of inner contradictions. The more free it is of its own inner contradictions, the more whole and healthy and wholehearted it becomes. And I thought, what a fantastic metaphor for the work we are trying to do in organisations. What if we saw ourselves as being in the business of building wholehearted organisations? And that's become effectively the mission statement for Agenda Shift. This is something that's just emerged in the last few months. I wrote a blog post quite a while before the book was published. And then I did a workshop in London. And in the evening of day one of the workshop, we had a wholehearted curry. So we met in a big curry restaurant in London. Curry's not as good as your curry, but it was still pretty good. But people came prepared to talk about wholehearted and what it meant to them. Where we've ended up with is this. First of all, seeing those obstacles, the what stops that question. Seeing those obstacles, imbalances, contradictions, all the things that stop us being wholehearted as opportunities for engagement. Opportunities for authentic conversations where we're not coming with the answers, but actually asking genuine questions in curiosity to actually find out what people's needs are and where they would like to get to, and so on. So genuine engagement, authentic engagement. Strategy, development and delivery properly integrated, not in so different that a common complaint that our assessment tool throws up is that people in development don't know what the strategy is. It's a very common complaint. I don't know if it's one that you recognise. But if you know anything about organisation theory, systems theory, management cybernetics and all the rest of it, is that you realise the health of your organisation does depend on these things being properly integrated. And the best way to integrate something is for people to talk to each other, participation. And we want to have these vital organisational processes celebrated for meeting needs. If we're not meeting needs, what is the point? Stop being solution-driven, start being needs-based and outcome-oriented. And lastly, the language of outcomes inviting leadership at every level. And as I said, there's this wonderful relationship between leadership and outcomes and invitation and so on. When you agree on an outcome, that's now an opportunity for people to come up with ideas, to step up and so on. You're actually creating leadership opportunity if you stop telling people what to do. It's such a simple idea. But it takes some discipline, some personal discipline in yourself as a leader or as a coach to encourage that leadership in others. New conversations and new kinds of conversations, renewing the organisation's discourse and thereby the organisation itself. This comes back to the fundamental bit of philosophy, it's called constructionism, that really underpins modern organisation development. Your organisation is socially constructed. It exists, maintains, and continues to evolve through the conversations that people have inside the organisation and across the boundaries of the organisation. Managers can't control every conversation, but you can start to have an influence on how those conversations happen. And that is how the organisation changes in the kind of direction that you want. You have had a small experience of every one of those bullets today, just through the exercise that you did. So as well as painting a picture of how we would like organisations to be, it is also very practically something that you can experience in a one-day workshop, in a two-day workshop, in a half-hour exercise, or whatever it might be. So that's me. I'm done, just in time. I hope that someone's need at least was met by this talk. I don't think we've left time for questions. It is now just coming up to 22. But I'm here for the next 2 days and I have a workshop afterwards. So I will be around. If you want to ask me anything, you can do so in one of the breaks. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.